Elementary music teacher friend, you love what you do, but you might feel unappreciated and, in fact, unseen some days. You may even feel like you're on a music teacher island and just want to connect with other music teachers who can relate to both your struggles and wins when it comes to teaching elementary music. I get you and understand completely the feelings you're having. That's why each and every week, the Elementary Music Teacher Podcast will provide you with solo and guest episodes that will help you realize you're not alone in your music teaching journey. Throughout each episode, my goal is for you to be able to walk away with actionable steps and ideas to help you feel like you're ready to take on the new week with whatever challenges may be thrown your way. Hi, I'm your host, Jessica Peresta, and I'm so glad you're here. Whether you're at home, in your car, in the shower, or wherever else you're listening, grab your cup of coffee or whatever other beverage is nearby and listen in to the Elementary Music Teacher Podcast.
Hi, I'm Sam Fessich from the EduMagic Podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hey friend, I want to let you know about a brand new free workshop that I am so excited about called How to Design Curriculum for Your Elementary Music Classroom, 5 Easy Ways to Simplify Lesson Planning. This free workshop will happen live at various dates and times throughout the year, but the first one is coming up within the next few weeks. So sign up so you'll be notified when the workshop is, and you can go to subscribepage.com/curriculum design workshop, or simply click on the link in the show notes. In this workshop, we'll go over starting with the end in mind, knowing your desired results for yourself and students, planning assessment before mapping out the lessons, and having a system in place. When you come to this workshop, I'm going to show you how you can make the ultimate shift from struggling with weekly lesson planning, feeling overwhelmed and exhausted knowing how to plan relevant lessons, to knowing how and what to plan each week by adding systems and a proven framework to your planning. So to sign up, once again, the link is subscribepage.com/curriculum design workshop, and I can't wait to see you there. Hello. I'm so excited to be back with another episode this week. And if you've been listening to the podcast for the last few episodes, I have been talking about curriculum design in a few different ways. And if you have not listened to the past couple episodes, I would encourage you to do that after you listen to this one, of course. And today we're going to talk about how assessment and lesson planning work together. This episode was on my heart because of the fact that I go back to my time in the classroom, and I remember, I know I need to assess my students, but I never really formed the connection between lesson planning and assessing. To me, it was two different buckets instead of these two things being in one bucket together. They're kind of like two puzzle pieces that fit together and work hand in hand together. And when you start viewing it that way, things go a lot more smoothly in your classroom. I'm sure I said that grammatically wrong, but you know what I mean. It goes smoother in your classroom, and lesson planning will start going easier. And it's going to be, when you sit down to plan, assessment will start making a little bit more sense of how to do it. There is a blog post that is in the show notes for this episode, and also the link to join me at the free workshop coming up next week is in the show notes as well, or just direct message me at Jessica Peresta on Instagram and I can shoot you a direct link to join. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Like I already said, assessment and lesson planning work together and not against each other. This is a mindset shift for some of you. Some of you are like, I already know that. Thank you, Captain Obvious. But others, this is going to be a mindset shift of how. Like, I know they should work together, but how do we get there? And we're going to talk about ways to do that today. But so many times teachers, including myself, do a great job lesson planning, but maybe you feel frustrated. I actually had this conversation with a teacher last week about this exact thing, feeling frustrated that okay, here's this concept I'm teaching, and then there's this new concept I'm teaching, and I don't feel like my students are connecting the dots or really understanding how they tie into each other. It makes you feel frustrated. So you're like, well, how does assessment help with that? When you plan for assessment and not just planning for the actual lesson, you will notice how much more your students are retaining. You'll be able to see this fluid thing of, okay, I assess them. I know where they're at. I know where the gaps are. So I'm ready and able to move forward and helping connect the dots with those students. And you're also, by the way, side note, when it comes to, and this isn't in the blog post, so those of you listening right now, you get an extra freebie, nugget of wisdom. But when you are trying to connect the dots between concepts, this is something that just takes time to figure out. How long do I spend on a certain concept versus how little do I spend on covering a certain concept? This is something that just takes time to figure out. Unfortunately, there is not just a simple snap your finger approach. Yes, follow a curriculum map. Yes, follow a scope and sequence. But my biggest piece of advice for that is make that document, whether it's on your computer, whether it's on paper, I don't care how you, whatever it's on, it's a fluid living documents. It is not just set in stone where, okay, I'm going to cover this concept for 4 weeks and this one for 2. No, it is moving. It is constantly changing, and you need to be able to adapt and adjust based on where your students are at, which ties directly into what we're talking about today with assessment. How will you know if your students are ready to move from one concept to the other? Well, you're assessing them. You're assessing them on an ongoing basis. And also, how do you connect those dots between concepts? So, okay, we're covering form, and the next week we're really focusing on melody. How do those two concepts connect? Well, when you're planning assessments, you can plan assessments that make sense to connect those concepts together. And I can get into that like way deeper, and I will. But today, I just want to say that for you, because I know some of you are really thinking that if I get that question from one teacher, I know that there's others that have that question as well. And I hope that made sense with how I explained it. If you need me to clarify any of that, just reach out to me and let me know. All right. So, first thing I want to talk about is how assessment shouldn't be an afterthought. We're all guilty about tacking on some kind of assessment to the end of a lesson and just saying, well, I know I need to do something, so this looks good, right? But assessment and lesson planning work together. While you're planning lessons, also plan for assessments. Plan how you're going to assess. One thing that you might find helpful is to maybe have a running Google Doc. Maybe you don't use Google, maybe you do, but I'm just going to use that as an example, where you have a bunch of assessment ideas listed out, mostly formal but also informal, but have assessment ideas listed out so you can say, when you sit down a lesson plan, instead of saying, I don't really know how I'm going to assess them, have ideas listed so you can go to that document when you feel stuck and say, oh, this would work. Okay, but instead of just doing this assessment, how am I going to do it in a way that makes sense for the ages of my students? So have a running list of assessment ideas and think about what makes the most sense for checking student understanding, the ages of your students, and particular classes. What works for one class, even in the same grade level, won't always work for another class. Side note, I had a conversation today. One of my sons, I have 3 boys, is in 5th grade. And those of you listening that teach 5th graders, you know what I'm talking about when I say this. This is that time of year when our beautiful babies start losing their minds a little bit. I can just be honest. This 5th grade class that my son is in has been getting in trouble in the music and art room. They will not be quiet. They are starting to have that 5th grade itis, as I love to lovingly refer to it as. And I know fifth graders, especially, you're going to have to just get kind of creative with assessment and lesson planning, especially this time of year. So that was a side note. But when I said every class is different, for some reason, my sweet baby boy is in this fifth grade class out of the 3 fifth grade classes at his school that is that class this year. So that's been fun on parenting side of things. But anyways, when talking about how assessment shouldn't just be an afterthought, consider both informal and formal assessment ideas. Remember also, it's about quality over quantity. You don't have to tie in 8 assessments into one class period. That's going to overwhelm you, and it's also going to confuse your students. So have a quality assessment formally, and then informally have just some quick ideas of ways you can informally assess your students, whether it's thumbs up, nodding, they're showing you fingers of a certain, if you're asking 1 through 4, for example, and then reconsider what you're doing if it is causing confusion for yourself and your students. The next thing I want to talk about is how assessment should be embedded throughout the lesson you're teaching. There, of course, are formal and informal assessments. These are both important and needed to assess for student understanding. I don't think it's one or the other. I think they're both important. They're also both great to help gauge where each class is and when they're ready to move on or need to stay on a concept for a while. This, by the way, is what I talked about in last week's episode, is where curriculum development comes into play. Because when you're checking for both individual and whole group understanding of a concept, it's ongoing and it's not just a one-time thing. So embed assessment in your lessons and weave them into what you're doing every single class period. When I talked about going to a list and making ideas, well, maybe you need to also add ideas for informal assessment. You're like, how am I going to assess what students are doing throughout the whole class period? Sometimes it's not stopping class for you to have students give you a thumbs up, for example. Sometimes you're just walking around, paying attention, marking down students who seem a little confused or don't know the answer, or just checking for understanding, ongoing. Be a facilitator in your classroom and not just the teacher. Point number 3 is students should be informally assessed on an ongoing basis. This ties exactly into point number 2. This kind of, I almost thought of these as one category, but I split them because I wanted to touch on this separately. A lot of times there's focus on formal assessment, and that is most of what is contributing to the actual grade you're turning in each 9 weeks. But as a teacher of any subject area or grade level, you are required to grade your students. How many assessments you come up with and the ways you're going to formally assess your students is completely up to you. But what's forgotten about a lot is informal assessment. There's already so much informal assessment being done in the music room while you're watching them, observing them, listening to your students, just paying attention to what they're doing and where they're at and what's going on. That is informal assessment. You may not have really thought about it that way, but that is what you're doing. So this shouldn't just be something that's done when your students are participating in an activity, for example, but it should be ongoing from the minute they come in the music room until the minute they leave. While your students are walking in, I have talked about this on the podcast before, you can have them doing body percussion or some kind of activity, even in the hallway, where they are being assessed that way. You're watching them and paying attention, and are they getting this? Are they grasping this body percussion activity, for example? That's even before they come in the music room, before they leave. Maybe you're doing exit tickets. And you can kind of tell by observing the students who are just kind of answering based on what the students around them are saying, or if they're really grasping what is going on. Are they really putting an answer on an exit ticket that makes sense? Or is it just kind of you can just tell they're kind of confused and just writing down whatever. Yes, that's a formal assessment, but that can also be informal, because if you're walking around and you're seeing someone's confused, you're observing them and you're helping them and watching them and asking them if they need help or clarification on something. So speaking of how assessments and lesson planning go hand in hand, I believe formal and informal assessment, sometimes they're done at the same time and done together as well. Point number 4 is how assessments need to tie into the concepts of being taught. Yes, 99% of you listening to this are very aware of that. But for the 1% listening, or for the 99% of you who need a little bit of a reminder, I wanted to touch on this because while you're thinking about and planning, remember how assessment and lesson planning work together. Okay, which is the whole point of this episode. But I wanted to say that because assessments need to tie into the concepts being taught. If you're focusing on having students, for example, describe the elements of music in a particular song, but the assessment, you're asking them to count rhythms, that's not related. And I, from doing teacher observations and when I had student teachers in the classroom, I have seen this happen a lot. And then I see the teacher feeling frustrated because their students aren't really understanding or grasping the concept they're teaching. And when I reminded them, well, your assessments aren't really tying into the concepts you're teaching. And you're making more work for yourself because when you do this, it's basically like you're planning two separate lessons instead of one lesson that has assessment embedded into it. So this is going to cause confusion for your students. They're not going to grasp the concepts because your assessment is assessing something different than what you were teaching that day. So when tying assessments to the concepts you're focusing on, this will save you tons of time and energy. When the assessments don't align with the concepts, it is going to cause confusion and it's going to cause you to feel like you're planning way more than you should be. A better way to assess the way students to describe elements of music in a particular song, for example, is to have them tell a partner. They can write about it, they can draw a picture of it, or even create a word wall about it, or any other idea you have. So just remembering on this point to tie the assessments with the concepts you're teaching is the important thing I want you to take away from this. The last point I want to talk about today is in backwards planning, assessment comes first. And I know a lot of you right now just pause this episode or you're sitting there like, what? What did she say? let me talk about this and explain what I mean. And I've touched on this before, but if you have not heard me say this, backwards planning, like when you use an instructional model like the ADDIE model, which I've talked about on this podcast a few episodes ago, assessment is thought about first and not last. We talked about this a lot during my master's in educational technology program. And I remember the first time I heard my professor talk about this, I went, what? What do you mean? Because as teachers, and in my teacher education program, when I was in the classroom, I knew assessment was important and I did plan for it, but I never planned for it first. It was always last. Why? I think most of the time when you're lesson planning, think about the document you lesson plan on. I know it's different for everyone. Some of you use sheets or docs or paper planners or sticky notes for sometimes just to keep it simple. I don't care how you plan, but when you look at a lesson planning format is what I'm getting at. What usually is the very last thing on there? It is assessment. It is usually last. And so naturally, we get to the assessment part of things last because it's listed last. So it's not, you're not doing it on purpose. You're just kind of going in order of, okay, well, I need to put an assessment here. So let's do this. So why should it be first though? When an assessment is done first and not last, you're going to know how you're wanting to check for student understanding, and then we'll be able to fill in the activities and lessons accordingly. This might take time to wrap your mind around, but once you flip the way you lesson plan, it's going to be a simpler process from what you're used to doing. It just takes a little bit of a mindset shift. And I know this might sound confusing, and I'm going to touch on this more in the curriculum design workshop coming up next week. So if you have questions about this though, I would just honestly encourage you even to, on Google, go to Google and type in backwards planning or backwards planning as a teacher, and you'll see what I'm talking about described in way more detail than I'm touching on today. So I would encourage you to also do your own research about backwards planning, what it is and why assessment should come first. And you'll get a little bit more understanding about what I'm talking about. So I hope to see you at the workshop. I am so excited to talk about curriculum development. This, I hope you can tell, is a huge passion of mine, something I really enjoy unpacking and helping you to connect the dots between lesson planning, assessment, creating curriculum for your classroom, and how you can do it as the music teacher. I'll be back next week with a new episode, and have an amazing week, friend. Well, hey there. Thank you so much for listening into the Elementary Music Teacher Podcast. There is an exclusive Facebook group just for listeners of this podcast and any elementary music teacher called the Elementary Music Teacher Community Facebook Group. Come on over and join us there, where we have conversations around the podcast episodes and encourage each other each and every week. And also head to my website, thedomesticmusician.com. I have some free resources there that you can download to help you gain traction in your classroom today, as well as the blog and the membership site and all kinds of other goodies to help you keep going in your music teaching journey. I cannot wait to keep connecting with you and encouraging you and spurring you on in your journey of teaching elementary music. Hang in there, have an amazing week, and I will see you soon.